I cannot convey any better the traumatic words that you'd hear on this 911 tape. And when I hear them today, my blood runs cold.
911, what's your emergency? I need an ambulance. My daughter's dying, I think. Rescue is needed. 3-year-old female child, unconscious, not breathing. Christina!
He is wasting away a life in a jail for a murder he didn't commit, and worse, for his own daughter with whom he loved.
There is a whole bunch of evidence now that links Masuk to the crime scene.
There is absolutely no evidence of any forced entry, any breaking in, and according to the defendant, the only people in that house with permission were himself and Christina.
This is Suspect Convictions. I'm Willis Kern with investigative journalist Scott Reeder. Today it's the story of two cousins who came to the assistance of another cousin. Grace Schlaffer is Barton McNeil's first cousin once removed. Chris Ross also was Bart's cousin. Grace lives in Indiana and Chris in California. And Bart, of course, is incarcerated in Illinois. It has become Grace and Ross's quest to free Bart, who they believe was wrongly convicted. In our culture, cousins are often relegated to little more than a supporting role. This wasn't always the case. Back in the 1960s, a popular sitcom was The Patty Duke Show about two mismatched cousins.
Do you think 30 sandwiches will be enough?
No, there are going to be 8 of us. Do you know, this is my very first slumber party. You've lived in Europe too long, cousin. Time you got acquainted with some of our swinging American cousins.
But they're cousins, identical cousins all the way.
And there have been shows about country cousins. There's Bo Duke and Daisy on the Dukes of Hazzard.
Just a good old boy, never meaning no harm. Beats all you never saw, been in trouble with the law since the day they was born.
And Jethro and Ellie Mae on the Beverly Hillbillies.
Listen to my story about a man named Jed. A poor mountaineer barely kept his family fed. And then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground come a bubbling crude oil, that is, black gold, Texas tea.
But what about someone trying to get a cousin cleared of murder? Well, there's my cousin Vinny.
A funny thing happened to William and Stanley on their way to college. They got framed for murder.
Whoa! We need to call an attorney, a great attorney.
He's not your typical hero.
We got an attorney in the family. Great, who?
He's
my cousin Vinny.
But in the case of Barton McNeil, Grace and Chris have interviewed witnesses, pored over documents, questioned detectives, and been instrumental in getting the Illinois Innocence Project involved in the case. Barton McNeil's attorney Gwen Jordan contends they are the dynamic duo.
Grace and Chris are fabulous advocates for Bart. It's unusual the amount of work that they've put into gathering evidence, following up on leads, doing investigations, in addition to providing Bart with, the much-needed support. There are other family members that have stood by their loved ones that are wrongfully imprisoned and been advocates for them. It's not completely unusual, but they absolutely have gone above and beyond because they truly believe that Bart is innocent.
For Grace Schlaffer, her involvement in the case began in the middle of the night on a porch in Colorado.
Bart's mother is my first cousin, and she passed away when Bart was just very young. His grandma is my aunt. So my father and his grandpa were brothers. My mother passed away in 95, and my dad came to live with me. And one of the things that my siblings, we all got together and bought Dad a bunch of airline tickets so he could travel and see people. And one of the people were his brother's wife in Colorado. We were spending the night in her place, and in the middle of the night, she woke me up and asked me to come sit out on the porch and talk with her. And I did. And she told me the story about Bart. I did not know when I went down there about Bart. And the only reason she told me is at the time, I had been dating an attorney for several years.
Grace's boyfriend at the time didn't practice criminal law and wasn't licensed to practice in Illinois, so he wasn't able to assist with the case. But Grace became intrigued. Before sitting on the porch with Bart's grandmother, Grace was unaware of McNeil.
She asked me if she could write him and give him my phone number to contact me. And a few weeks later, I got a letter from him, a long letter. Bart knows exactly how many pages is one stamp worth.
Bart says Grace was his lifeline to the free world.
My grandmother was the one person that had this innate recognition of my innocence, sort of started the wheels in motion and advised me to contact Grace. So I wrote Grace a letter, and she wrote back right away and was real receptive to anything I had to say and sort of volunteered to help. And from there, I put her to work. I had her do a whole bunch of things. She went to the courthouse, made photocopies of all of my court records, photocopied a ton of other stuff, paid for a typewriter for me to use in the prison to type up my appeals, made phone calls, sent emails, contacted DNA experts, contacted a lot of these innocence organizations, and so forth. So she was very active on my behalf, spent a lot of time and a little bit of money, come down here to the prison and visit me a couple of times, which was the first time that I met her, brought her elderly father along. And she worked pretty hard for probably 2 or 3 years.
Grace is a sweet older lady who has worked a variety of jobs over the years. At the time she began investigating Bart's case, she was the primary caregiver for her father, who lived to be 98 years old. Often Grace would take her father with her as she conducted her investigations.
Sometimes once a week, every week of the month. I was retired. I didn't have anything that great pressing me at the time. It all fell together pretty easily.
How far is it between Indianapolis and Bloomington, Illinois?
I think 3 hours, maybe.
You were getting out on the road for 6 hours, round trip, to drive to Bloomington with your dad, who was in his 90s? Man, that's a real commitment.
My dad walked for 2 miles every day till he died. My dad was a bill of health. I spent a lot of time in the courthouse. Back then, you couldn't take pictures. I can go to a courthouse now and just take my cell phone and take pictures of the documents. Before, I had to clip a paper clip on them, and then they'd go through and do it, and then I'd have to pay them for it, and it was expensive. I also talked to court reporters that did some of the hearings and stuff, and they sent me transcripts. I met with the neighbor, Susan. She contacted me one day on Facebook. The neighbors always told me that they thought Masuk was going to do something because he moved over there and they knew it to get away from her. And she would be constantly over there pounding on the door, yelling at him to let her in, and he wouldn't let her in. So I was surprised to hear that she was ever even in the apartment.
Grace believes in Bart's innocence, but is not blind to Bart's shortcomings.
Listening to the 911 call, does that sound like somebody who just murdered his kid? Do I think Bart was a precious little soul? He was just like the rest of us. We all have our evil thoughts and doings. And I don't mean evil thoughts of murder, but I mean evil desires like other women. Do I think he was right in going with Masuk in the first place? No. I think loyalty to your wife is what you vow to, and I'm not for that. So did he look otherwise? Yes. And was he wrong? In my opinion, yes. You don't just all of a sudden one day love somebody else. You don't turn off love that easy.
As time went on, Bart noted that Grace spent less time on the case.
After a while, she began to get discouraged at the lack of results and sort of fell off for a while. She did a lot of the advanced work that made things a lot easier.
Grace acknowledges her discouragement, but says it is not because she stopped believing in her cousin's innocence.
I had 3 strokes. It has impaired my short-term memory. And I kept finding myself not getting my work done, even though I thought I had done it.
Grace reached out to Bart's cousin, Chris Ross, in California, and asked him to take the lead in advocating for Bart.
And I finally just said, Chris, you're going to have to take over this. And Chris was so much younger and more knowledgeable on getting information. I could call people, so he's had me always calling people and taking notes. And we worked it out that way. But it got to being where Chris just was spending a lot of time he was spending too much time that was costing him financially, I thought. He didn't say that to me, but I felt that he believed in Bart so much. He just did everything he could.
This is Suspect Convictions. I'm Willis Kern with Scott Reeder. And Scott, we're hearing from Grace Schlaffer talking about her difficulties in trying to work hard for her long-lost cousin, Barton McNeil, and get him free from prison. You had a chance actually to sit down and talk with her. You visited with her early on in our project here. What was Grace like?
Just the sweetest lady. I mean, I just was really impressed. I was out in Indianapolis for the CrimeCon convention in June, and I knew that she lived in the Indianapolis area, so I gave her a call and wanted to see if she wanted to get together for a bite to eat. And we sat down and talked, and she was at first really nervous because I don't think she's dealt with reporters very much. And I just said, hey, I'm not going to take notes or anything, let's just talk. And she was just so nice and really, I would call her a spiritual person. I mean, if you were to ask me what do I think motivates Grace, I think it's her Christian faith. I think that she really thinks that injustice has been done here, and she really feels motivated by her faith to take action and do something about it.
So I take it then after that session with her that you really weren't that surprised that she would take up this interest in Barton McNeil's case after really not even know this man existed most of her life.
Yeah, I'm still surprised. I mean, I think that she is a terrific person. I mean, a very spiritual person. But let's face it, Willis, how many people do you know that would devote many hours a week, travel extensively with their elderly father to investigate a crime involving somebody they never met? Yeah, there's a distant relationship. I mean, she is his first cousin once removed, but she didn't even know he existed. And now she's traveling all over the place, interviewing neighbors and talking to police officers who worked the case and talking to court reporters and going through piles and piles of court documents and spending a small fortune on duplication fees and everything else. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's above and beyond what most people would ever expect. I mean, could you see any of your cousins suddenly stepping forward if you had some legal trouble and investing themselves that way?
Well, I would hope so, but I could find plenty of reasons why they wouldn't or maybe why they shouldn't do that. Of course, the Barton McNeil case is a little bit different than, I guess, your average criminal thrown in jail as we've been unfolding over these past several weeks. I want to ask you a little bit about how does Grace process the evidence against Bart? Did you get any sense about that when you were talking with her?
Yeah, the fascinating thing about this is she was gung-ho into this case, investing 40, 50 hours a week into this case before Masuk committed the murder against her mother-in-law. So lots of people have come forward and say, well, I wonder if Bart's innocent after Masuk went out, the alternate suspect in the first murder, comes forward and kills somebody else.
Which is almost like the aha moment in this whole case. Right. Mm-hmm.
But Grace was fully invested in this case for years before that happened. So I think that she genuinely believes that Bart is innocent. I mean, one thing she said was, listen to that 911 tape. Does that sound like a guilty person to you? She very much is a believer in Bart's innocence. I mean, when you talk to her, there's no room for doubt. I mean, she really believes in his innocence. So I found that intriguing that she would invest herself that much into helping somebody she'd never met. You know, Gwen Jordan is one of the attorneys that's working the case on behalf of Bart, and she has her own theories on what motivates Chris and Grace in helping their cousin.
I really believe what drives them is that there's been an injustice here to someone that they are related to, and they feel an obligation to do anything they can to help him because he's innocent. I feel this way. I think most of the attorneys and the staff that work on innocence projects feel this way. We don't know these people, but when you find out that there's an innocent person that's in prison, and especially because these cases involve, really serious crimes, so these people are in maximum security prisons under just horrific conditions. I wish every prosecutor and every governor would have to go and tour a maximum security prison. And I think they would think twice about how many people they put in those institutions and for how long. It's inhumane, the way that prisoners are treated, whether they're guilty or innocent. But especially when a person's innocent, to be imprisoned in one of those horrific places, if you have any connection to that person, you will do whatever you can to get them out. Even though maybe they weren't close to Bart beforehand, they do have a connection with him, and they see this injustice. I mean, it's impossible to imagine what it's like to be innocent and to lose your liberty. And then take it a step further and see what the kind of conditions these people are living in. It's a place full of violence. People are raped and beat up and fear for their lives every day. And if they're innocent, how would you live with yourself if you didn't do all that you could to get them out?
For Chris Ross, Bart has brought purpose to his life.
Chris, something got you interested in this case. Why don't you tell me about that?
Well, what happened was Mazook went on to murder again. And at that point in time, it took Bart almost a month or more to even learn that she had killed again. Fortunately, someone within the prison population informed him of this because he had long since lost touch with Mazook. But she went on to murder again, and right there in McLean County, of all places. So Bart found out about it, and Bart, during one of his abilities to go out to the prison yard and make phone calls, was almost miraculously able to call local radio station in Bloomington, WJBC. They answered the phone. Normally you have to kind of have this all set up and prearranged, but he was able to, out of the blue, call them up and say, "Hey, this is Bart, and I just found out that my former girlfriend has murdered again, by strangulation, no less, and this is always the woman that I've stated had murdered my daughter, and if this doesn't show my innocence, then I don't know what does." He was able to get on the radio station, and that recording got passed around to our family, and I heard that, and I said, "This sounds like the words of an innocent man."
Your mom found out about this, and then she told you? So how exactly did all this work?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Came by way of a friend of Bart's who sent it to my second cousin. Her name is Grace, to the side of my family I didn't even know existed.
Okay. Do you and Grace talk very much?
We do. We speak usually about every week or two. When we first started working on Bart's case, we'd almost speak daily and communicate, of course, by email as well. So we kept extraordinarily busy the first couple of years as was convicted, and we were working with the Innocence Project to help secure Bart's freedom.
Would the Innocence Project be involved in this case at all if it wasn't for the work you and Grace have been doing?
No, I don't believe so. I think that Bart had always pleaded with many innocence organizations for many years to take up his case, and most innocence projects, they receive about 300 to 400 applications each year, so it's hard for them to sift through and sort and decide what's the case that they want to take. So I don't believe that they would have.
Many defense attorneys say one of the most trying parts of their job is dealing with family members of the accused. But Gwen Jordan says that's not the case with Chris and Grace.
I can't always give them the answers or the time that I'm sure that they would like, because I have so many other things that I have to do. But I completely understand it, and I appreciate it. And especially with Chris and Grace, I mean, they are never critical or angry. They're always calling to get an update or with an idea about here's another possibility, something to look at. And in both cases, oftentimes they have great insights and good ideas. So I wish I had more time to be able to devote to them. But no, I completely understand and appreciate how much they care about Bart and are working towards his exoneration.
Over the years, Bart and Chris have formed a close friendship.
I spend probably at least 5 to 10 hours a week working on his behalf. And when the whole project first began, it was more about a 20 to 30-hour work week. It seemed like I would put my kids to bed around 10 o'clock, and then once they're fast asleep, work from, say, 10:30 at night until 2 a.m. in the morning sometimes.
I guess you really hadn't done anything in the way of investigating a crime before you got involved in this case. Is that right?
That's right. I really didn't spend much time watching television or CSI episodes, so I was a complete newbie. When all the case files started to come to me, I started to read, and you learn that there's things called police narratives, where a police will interview someone, and then it's up to the detective, to write kind of their recounting of what was said. So as I poured through all these documents, I found them very amazing in that each and every document that I would pick up and look at, it really said to me, Bart is innocent and Mazook is guilty, and why did they not see this? It just seemed so utterly obvious to me that Bart was innocent all along, and Mazook was incredibly suspicious and looking guilty each step of the way. It all of a sudden kind of shattered my faith in the criminal justice system here in America, and where we all believe in justice for all. That's not the case. There's a lot of people, I think, that have been wrongfully convicted that are, whiling away their years in prisons in America.
One of the things that's kind of perplexed me a little bit is it seems like you and Bart have almost become like brothers, haven't you?
Yeah, I would say so. I don't have a brother. I look forward to the day when he's free and released, and will think of him as my older brother. Absolutely.
That's Chris Ross, the cousin of Barton McNeil, who has worked tirelessly over the last several months and years, really, to help free his cousin from his prison sentence. Well, Scott, Chris is someone who you speak to frequently. He's a very persistent person. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how Chris's interest in this manifests itself in your eyes.
Well, I talk to Chris probably 2 or 3 times a week at least. I mean, he's very persistent. He's a strong advocate for his cousin. He always is bounding with enthusiasm when I talk to him. Like, he gets excited and he wants to talk about the case and talk about things. He's a big fan of this podcast, as a matter of fact. He listens to it, and then he calls and gives me suggestions about what we could have done better and what we ought to be looking at next. And sometimes I agree with him, sometimes I don't, but he's certainly an interesting character. What's fascinating to me, though, Willis, is it seems like these two people who really didn't know each other before this case have become extraordinarily close.
Well, I would imagine so. I would imagine that if Chris is constantly talking to you on the phone, he's probably constantly talking to Barton on the phone as well.
Yeah, he is. I mean, he'll call me a lot of times after he's got off the phone with Bart and fill me in on what Bart has to say. I mean, he actually, if you can believe this, he will download this podcast off the internet, put his phone up against the computer speaker, and play it for Bart every week. So Bart listens to it. And then Bart will actually type up or a response to whatever was said by the prosecutors or give his critique and then post it on freebart.org. I mean, have Chris actually post it on freebart.org. So there's a very close relationship there. But, the two seem so much alike. I mean, their personalities seem very much alike. Their temperaments seem very much alike. They talk a lot alike. Their voice patterns even are similar. So it's fascinating to me to see how much they have in common. I mean, these two folks that maybe met once or twice in their entire life.
And Chris remains optimistic that eventually Barton will get out of prison, right?
Yeah, he does. He does. And he talks about, I said, well, what do you expect when Bart gets out? And he goes, well, I want Bart to be free. I'd love for him to come out here to California and be with me. But, it's up to Bart where he's going to be. And he talks about that. He talks about, this bond that's developed between the two of them. And it's very interesting.
While Chris Ross remains optimistic that Bart will eventually be a free man, Grace Schlaffer isn't so sure.
Grace, I have to ask this. This is more of a philosophical question. Has helping Bart given you purpose in life?
It did at the time, and I was a very happy person, where I've become more negative now.
Why have you become more negative?
Mistrust of the system. Not having anything in my power to do anything. No matter what I do, it didn't help Bart, other than to talk to him. I do love that man. I think he is a wonderful person. I mean, as a cousin, I love him. but I believe in his innocence. I always will. I know someday I'll know for sure, but in my mind it's for sure. I just don't think that it could continue for 20 years without some kind of a breakdown if it wasn't true. It just can't.
Next week during Suspect Convictions, you'll hear from a prominent true crime podcaster and a prominent true crime blogger. They, like you, have been carefully digesting each episode of Suspect Convictions, and they'll talk about the evidence, the unusual situations of this case, and who they think was ultimately responsible for Christina McNeil's death. That's next week during Suspect Convictions. Special thanks to Colin Thompson, WGLT General Manager R.C. McBride, and the production staff of Sound Ideas, including Mike McCurdy, Charlie Schlinker, and Ryan Denham. With investigative journalist and Suspect Convictions creator Scott Reeder, I'm Willis Kern. We'll see you next week on Suspect Convictions.